when we talk about the Sufis, do you concede then that there was Gnostic impulses carried through among some Sufi sects that these guys may have recognized?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely no question about it in my mind. There is no doubt that Sufism is the gnosis of Islam. There's just no question in their own thoughts, etc. It has been, and this is why they're not appreciated.
Yeah.
You know, they're bullied. Sufis are bullied in the East.
Bullied, they're killed.
Bullied. Not necessarily killed, not necessarily locked up, but just pushed around. You know, they're regarded as...
Yeah, but many places, they are murdered, many places.
And that too, yes. But that's more recent, I think. But I mean, even in Turkey 20 years ago, they could only dance the whirling dervishes were only allowed to dance at certain times. But that was a secular rule, of course, not a religious one. Whereas today, in Tehran, Sufis are discouraged from public assembly, that sort of thing. You've got that going on.
Notwithstanding Wahhabism and Saudi Arabia and all that, it's terrible.
Well, it's the absence of, when people talk about, Islam's a peaceful religion, I sometimes think that they're talking about that part of it which has the least, contemporary terms, the least power of expression. But if you look historically at the origin of the Sufis, as far as one can, they seem to emerge at precisely the time the Sabian witness goes quiet in the 9th century. That seems to be the case. So I think there's a historic link with the Hermetic school of Mesopotamia, for sure. I do. And, there is I wrote a novel about all this.
Let's hear.
About the Yazidis.
Really?
Yes.
What's it called?
It's called the Babylon Gene.
And by the way, the Yazidi, just for those who don't know, is this fire worshipping tradition?
It is one of the two. Well, I think there are when we talk about Gnostics or the Gnostic movement of the 2nd, 3rd century, there are only two authentic movements who show a direct link to the period, in my judgment, directly. Okay. And that one is the Mandeans of Iraq, and then the Yazidis.
But they are the inheritors of Zarathustra, right? Zoroaster.
There's Zoroastrian elements in the faith of the Yazidis, but it's an oral tradition, which I think is one of its great strengths. It's an oral tradition, and there's no dogma. And their testimony historically is phenomenal. It's extraordinary. They have been persecuted hideously, since 1,000 years now.
And still are.
Yeah. And very few people know about it, which worries me. Why don't people know about this sort of thing? Why don't they know? Why aren't we told? Anyway, I give an account of them in that particular novel. It was the point of writing a novel for me was to be able to write about the Yazidis with the intense admiration I feel for their tradition, which again has been travestied by the ignorant.
As always.
And the Babylon Gene, it's totally set in the period of 2004, 2006, the Gulf. The new war against Saddam, post 9/11, and the attempt to annihilate the Yazidis.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Which I predicted in the book exactly. Wow. I'm sorry to say, when I wrote it in 2005, it was published. 3 years ago, and it sold moderately. It's had some nice reviews and all that, and somebody said, show Dan Brown what it's really all about. That was a friend said. So I wrote the Babylon Gene.
Okay.
But yeah, that's really to show how all these things matter. The hero of it is an advisor to the British intelligence, and it's about how conspiracy stories and mythology about Freemasonry, Jews and all that stuff is going to be used by insane terrorists or manipulative forces. The eruption of the human and the spiritual into religion in the late antique period and in the Roman Augustan period, this eruption of a new conception of religion that is humane and spiritual and given a mythic and cultic formula, it was a revolution whose profundity people still don't understand the depth of it and the challenge of it, and how it leaves man in a far more difficult situation than the old pagans or even the old Jews had to deal with. We can't take refuge in nature anymore. We are going to be dealing with new knowledge. And we're dealing now with this immense outpouring in the modern scientific period, which all the old religions are reacting against. This is why I said at the very beginning of our talk, it's about reactions. Science and knowledge and new knowledge causes tremors and reactions in religious people. Yeah. And the natural thing is, the earthbound always see new knowledge as satanic. If it comes from the stars, it's Lucifer. It's the light from above. They from the earthbound perspective, from the materialist perspective, all new knowledge has satanic. Because in a way, of course, all new knowledge is power, and power can always be used for good or evil. And experience tells us that generally we must be afraid because new knowledge will be used for bad. Yeah. And this is the ambiguity of knowledge. Modern science doesn't understand this. It's still got this childlike, unenlightened view that knowledge is good. Well, knowledge is knowledge. It's not necessarily good. It's not necessarily evil. It depends entirely on the spiritual predisposition of the user. Yeah. Look at Einstein's dilemma when he was confronted with the reality for the first time of the atomic bomb. And he doesn't know where to go. Who can he knows he's one of the authors of this terrible thing. Without him,
like Dr. Frankenstein.
Yeah, I think it sort of hexed him.
Yeah, it's an old dilemma.
And he says, God, you can see, are we able to use this knowledge? Do you really know what you're doing? Well, of course, the state always knows best. Yeah. We got to do it. Thanks for the knowledge, Albert, and we're still watching you because we know you're a communist at heart. Right. And, here's science. Suddenly he knew he was a prostitute. He had prostituted his knowledge, and it was going, he thought by going to America to escape the Nazis, he was on the right side. But he's faced with this awful sense that maybe it is not as simple as that.
No, maybe the monster's still there.
Yes. I think these questions are raised by the Rosicrucian phenomenon to a profound degree, because it is forget the esoteric version of Rosicrucianism. It's a debate about knowledge and new knowledge and what it will mean. I think this has been missed out.
But the problem today isn't, I think, so much the esoteric interpretation of it as it is the conspiratorial aspect. I mean, you'll find most people today, if they hear words like Masons and Rosicrucians, they immediately think of some sinister conspiracy. The poor Rosicrucians.
Well, that's one of the reasons I've spent my life writing these, trying to do this stuff to try and stem the damage done by this tsunami of conspiracy nonsense, which is is far more dangerous than we could have imagined. Many of the murders that have taken place throughout the world, not only with the fundamentalists and so forth, but also, in America, the claims of people to special knowledge of what's going on. This isn't a minor thing, and I've always thought theologians should be engaged with this whole issue. I wrote my books to say, well, look, I've got no axe to grind. I want to try. I like you want to know what the truth is, and I'm giving my best efforts to find out what that is, because I think beyond the madness there is a sanity. We are in danger of being overwhelmed by the insanity. This last 2 weeks have been horrendous for us because it's
last 2 months, last 2 years. I mean, where to begin? Yeah.
Yes, all of this.
Well, it doesn't help that the Rosicrucians style themselves as invisible and among, everyone for completely different reasons. These things are taken. Buzzwords are taken.
Remember, they meet in the Pharma, the brothers meet in the house of the Holy Spirit, which is invisible. Even though people pass it by every day, they see, but they do not see. It is people who are not looking for, I'm the leader of the Rosicrucians. Meet, it's people whose spiritual orientation is unrecognized by the world, by the wicked world, by the materialist concept, by the materialist.
So it is a gnosis then?
Oh, well, yes, in the purest sense, it is. It is spiritual knowledge, yes. It's marifa, as they say in Sufism. It's the mystical knowledge of man seen sub specie eternitatis. Man in his. We are physical beings. The only hope for mankind is the spiritual concept. There is no other. Yes, you can rationally shore up the dam of your existential distress by saying I'm doing it for the future, or I'm passing myself on through my children, all the usual stuff. But the fact of the matter is the only salvation is a spiritual one. I don't think that Andrei would have been happy with the word Gnostic, because if he was familiar, which I'm sure he was, with Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Tertullian, and the patristic fathers, I'm sure he would have been uneasy about the word Gnostic, but I suspect he had a place in his mind that recognized that there was more to it than the patristic enemies of the Gnosis had to say.
But the irony here is that it's not possible to make it. It's an experience-based, not a teaching-based impulse then. So it's very hard to make it into a movement because it's so individual.
Yeah, and I don't think Andrei was trying to be any more than a catalyst for a change. I don't think he had any delusion that all people will respond. You don't have to prove this by saying there was a group of people in Florence, there was a group of people in Turin, or there was a group of people. The Rosicrucian story is simply one way of expressing the universal truth. The true godly people have never been absent from the world, though they are not seen by the world. You try and go on television today in Britain and talk about the things we're talking tonight. You won't get there.
No,
you won't get.
No, you'll be burnt before.
The Rosicrucian message is as invisible in so-called Great Britain today as it was in the 17th century. They don't want to know why, because it doesn't tell you how you can make £1 million out of a barrel of horse shit. If it did, believe me, we would hear nothing else but this, brother. Although you may argue that secret would be kept very secret again, so you may be losing there as well. But the fact, this is what we are talking about spiritual truth. Spiritual truth is not a commodity that states and capital are interested in, and it's exactly the same today as it was in the 17th century. The difference in the early 17th century, there was this apocalyptic hope that somehow the skies were going to open and this divine knowledge would come to all men. It would be appreciated.
Oh, that's no difference. No, people believe that today too, my friend.
Yeah, but we're not talking, they're not expecting wisdom from the skies.
Oh, well, the UFOs.
You're talking about fundamentalists. You're talking about the pseudo-apocalypse of the materialists.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, the brethren from space will give us all that, etc. So.
Well, that's materialistic.
Yeah, it is.
It's like Seventh Adventist or something. Jesus is going to fly through outer space. All this. It's not what we're talking about.
No.
The Invisible College was a phrase of Robert Boyle. Mm-hmm. And Robert Boyle was writing to a friend, and he said that he and his pals at Oxford, now I was at Oxford, so I know the gag, and his pals had really formed a kind of invisible college. What he meant was that he was studying, I think, at Wadham College, I forget which college he was at, and his friends who shared this Rosicrucian excitement, that there was a how can I say, a religious, a spiritual connection. In other words, he began to see that God wanted men to explore nature in its deepest recesses, that it was a religious ideal to know about nature. And because he was a Protestant and an evangelical, he was very excited about this. He said, in other words, he'd formed a kind of an invisible college, meant I'm at this college, they're at that college, but actually we're a kind of college of our own. Now, this is a play on words. The fact that the house of the Holy Spirit is invisible does not mean that Boyle is saying that they've got the Royal Society. Anyway, the Royal Society wasn't invisible, nor was the Gresham College meetings which preceded it invisible, nor were the meetings in Oxford that Boyle. But they've pushed it much further than that, haven't they? In the theory. Yeah. So you have the idea that there was a secret society doing this. It wasn't secret. It was just we know that Friends of Ashmole formed. I know from my book, because it's not in any other. I've named the names. Nathaniel Henshaw, his brother, and others formed a society in London in the early 1650s, deliberately based on André's book, The Model of a Christian Society. That attempt to form that society, where they practiced alchemy and wrote about it, and Ashmole was involved, and Robert Child was involved, and other people you may know from the period, they really did try to form. Well, it was a model of a Christian society, but of course the model of a Christian society of André was the Rosicrucian Society. So they in fact formed probably the first articulate Rosicrucian society in the world. And that definitely contributed to establishing societies such as the Royal Society, but also I'm sure it influenced Freemasonry in London.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
It was one of the intellectual streams that was around at that time. Now, we've lost a lot of the documentation because the so-called Grand Lodge, which was basically a Whig creation from 1716 onwards, they destroyed a lot of the early documentation of the...
purposely?
Oh, yes. They said it was, according to James Anderson, who was a Scottish Protestant, he said it was so that it would... scrupulous brethren did it, he said, so it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. Wow. Well, you don't burn your manuscripts because somebody else might get them. You look after them, don't you? I mean, the fact of the matter is that the lodges that were formulated after 1716 in London were dominated by a different kind of people to those who were operating in the very, very few lodges in London and little bits of England at that time. Anyway, that's all in my book, Freemasonry, The Reality. The point was, how did you spend your time in the process? And Ashmole devoted his life to alchemy and the kind of purely scientific interests, which became the Royal Society, founded in 1661. Now, Masonry, as we know it, is a development of a later period, 50 years later. This whole thing is sort of reborn out of what's left of the 17th century movement, but a kind of new Masonry.
You think about your United Grand Lodge, right?
Well, you don't get a United Grand Lodge till 1813. It was the Grand Lodge of London. They called themselves a Grand Lodge to aggrandize themselves. There was no Grand Lodge. What you had the Company of Masons, which is a trade body, but it had, we imagine, some form of esoteric ritual, but we have no idea what it was. But we have indications from people who were associated with the movement, and the whole thing was taken over by the Whigs, that is, the supporters of the Protestant Hanoverians, in the early 18th century. And the movement was then dominated by government, people sympathetic to the Hanoverian regime. And that was the Masonry that was exported to Germany and to France. Or that France was interesting because in Paris, you also had the older Masons coming in, supporting the Stuarts. So Masonry in Europe then reflects British political crises between the Jacobites, supporters of the Stuarts dynasty, and the supporters of the German Protestant Hanoverians. And in Paris, the so-called Scottish, hence Stuart, etc., Masons form their own lodges. They are political lodges linked to the cause of the Stuarts. And that distinction between Scottish Masonry and English Masonry is with us today. And it was a political crisis. It comes out of the political crisis of the late 17th, early 18th century. In that world, it was a natural world, especially on the continent, more than England. Esoterica was bound to flourish. And there's only ever been one brand of esoterica, and it's more or less, we can call it Hermetic. We now probably use the word Gnostic. They wouldn't have used that word then, but it would have been a Hermetic universalism. And the lodge is an obvious place for that to happen, because here is a place where men of different faiths, Catholic, Protestant, different nations, can meet in brotherhood.
Uneducated.
Uneducated. And the whole concept of we are interested in knowledge. You know, there is a link between this Rosicrucian ideal of free knowledge chimes in with the Masonic idea, which is that all good knowledge is the Mason's work. Plus, once you elevate the idea of the pillars into the idea of the temple, well, the temple of God. In the 18th century, the idea of the Templum Dei is nature. So the Mason becomes a builder of a new concept of universal being, of universal nature. So a scientist can express his spiritual longing through his brotherhood, which is universal. And this is the foundation of what could have been a phenomenally amazing world. And this was, of course, the hope. This is what people at Ashmole had seen the seed of. But, of course, it starts to hit political realities. Masonry hits up against the Catholic Church in Austria and Germany, southern German states, and so on. And Masonry, like all these things, is neutered and turned into a boys' club, which it is today.
Yeah.
A boys' club with many wonderful boys in it who have great, a few of them I know have wonderful Rosicrucian dreams. I believe very strongly in the goodness of the philosophy of Masonry. I do. What I'm not interested in is belonging to any club concept. The moment it becomes a club, I'm not interested. I'm interested in the philosophy. I'm interested in the history. I think the principles of Masonry are tremendously important. But the fact is they're part of a social system which is now controlled by the status quo of whatever country they're in. And we know that in really unfree, nobody's free, but in the really unfree parts of the world, Masonry is, of course, forbidden completely, especially the Islamic world. There's been tremendous hatred of Masons, all sorts of propaganda, because the protocols of the Elders of Zion is their excuse, which was dreamt up by the Okhrana, the Russian Secret Service. And, these people in these countries who are Masonically inspired run tremendous risks, and they should be supported. I met this Hungarian man recently, and the persecution of Masons in Hungary is a fact today. Masons and Jews, all that stuff. Yeah. And to be a Mason in Hungary today, it requires real courage.
Yeah, but it's almost a Nazi government, isn't it?
Yes. So, but we don't hear in English news, no reports on this at all. There hasn't been a single report in the English news about what's happening in Hungary.
Really?
Yeah.
What about Greece? You get something from them?
Nothing. I can tell you, the English people kept in a kind of baby innocence. Really, I'm not kidding. I'm astonished. We got free transport of knowledge, but nobody's transporting it.
There's nothing to transport anymore.
It's like you can get everything you want, but apparently nobody wants it.
Yeah. Well, there's nothing new under the sun because, Hermetic, Gnostic streams have been suppressed time immemorial. So we see that, even the Masons, the Yazidis, the Sufis, the Kabbalists, you name it.
Yeah.
I could go on, but the point is that these subcurrents have always been suppressed by the powers that be, and it's still going on. Even in so-called free countries, we see the pressure building up. And that's where the so-called junk conspiracy comes in.
Exactly.
These, on the one hand, I criticize the completely oblivious to powerful authorities within spiritual religious spheres, and on the other hand, I complain about these small groups which are pointed out as scapegoats, and completely blind to the fact that totalitarian regimes cracks down on them and persecutes them.
Yeah, fair enough. But the Western media is generally blind to this, and since most journalists seem to be of a sort of more or less left liberal point of view, they think the idea, what any of them who know about Masonry will probably say, well, it's an old-fashioned thing past its time. Well, you could argue that about everything, religion, Christianity,
Yeah, but there has been particular accusations, even against Rosicrucians, even though they hardly exist, but also against Masonry, especially this conspiracy view that there's something sinister. Then you have, of course, examples of real corruption that doesn't exactly help.
What is more sinister than any government body?
Yeah.
The word conspiracy means to whisper, conspire. That's all it means. It means people saying things that you don't know about. Well, governments are doing it all the time. They are the conspirators. They create the conspiracy theories. Then some poor sap writes a paperback book saying we're not being told the truth, and he's called a conspiracy theorist. Well, we're not being told the truth is the point.
Yeah, but what would you say to those who pick at?
You can't get into every single conspiracy theory. It's a joke. It's like talking about your neighbors. Who knows what? Do you know? Do I know? Do I know what? I write about what I know about, and I can tell you that from my point of view that there isn't any institution in the world that is perfect.
Yeah, but the big question is there any institution in the world who deliberately try to destroy the world as their fantasy is?
Well, I like James Bond films. And we identify with Bond, don't we? So most of us don't want anybody manipulating the world. I don't know any evidence of any covert Masonic system. Of all the thousands of people who repeat the same story, which was first dreamt up by Hammer Purgstall in 1818, that there's some kind of antichrist movement.
Exactly.
All this stuff is just the same story repeated.
It stems from fundamentalistic circles and right-wing extremist circles.
I'm afraid it does. And perfectly decent people, well, I say perfectly decent, but deeply unimaginative and uninformed people buy this stuff because it suits them. There's not much you can do about it in a world with a free press. You can publish a refutation, but then they publish an anti-refutation. Yeah. You can publish your anti-refutation. So, and this is the way it's going to be. I can only say truth will out, but very few people will recognize it. Truth is not a democratic phenomenon, I'm afraid to say. People tend to believe what they're, depending on how frightened they are of anything at any particular time, conditions what they will accept as true. This is the human weakness. And we're,
very good point.
We're very far from dealing with this. Everybody in their life wants to achieve something, even if it's destructive. Some people would rather be known for being destructive than the harder road, which is to create. I like to think there's a conspiracy of love. I like to think there's a conspiracy of truth. I like to think there's a conspiracy of knowledge, that people are working secretly, quietly, and without attention to make this world a truly more beautiful experience for everybody who wants a beautiful experience. And that's the key point. Do you want a beautiful experience? Well, some do, and tragically, some don't think they do. Now, we went through all this in the 60s. This business, do you want a better world? Well, how do we get it? Do we listen to ABBA records or go to the discotheque, or what do we take drugs? What's the way to this better world? I don't think there's ever been any consensus on precisely what makes people better. And yet we know it when we see it. And people kid themselves that there's some cheap, nasty, easy way. There isn't. The spiritual road, I'm sorry, it seems like I'm dictating. I don't mean to, but
no.
My own view is that the Rosicrucian mystique is a positive one, and I don't feel the need to defend it because I don't know of any crime committed by Gnostics. I don't think Gnostics are known for mass murder. I don't think the Gnostics are known for rape. I don't think they're known for blowing up innocent people. I think they might be known for some curious opinions that their contemporaries think are strange or odd or disturbing or unacceptable.
Or subversive to the powers that be.
Subversive to the powers that be. But do we know who the powers that be really are? This is the question. Do we know who are the powers that be? I think they're mostly imaginary.
There's no invisible finger, invisible hand.
Only if we believe it. You know, Satan is quickly neutralized when you're not afraid. It is fear that generates the nightmare, isn't it? When you have nightmares at night, it's because something in your life is troubling you. We generate the fear.
Could we say that the rose is a symbol of love?
The rose?
Mm.
Yes, you can. I would say...
the antidote to fear?
Yeah. I like the fragrance notion. Yes. What is the antidote to fear? Courage? Truth, I would say. Truth. And al-haq, as the great Sufi said. I am the truth. To not understand what that means, you've got to be an exalted mind.
Gnosis auton, I think, is demanded here.
This idea. We have access as individuals to the highest gifts that God has to offer. That's the message of the farmer. We have access. It is there. The promise exists. Do we know how to deal with that promise is the question of today. Can we grasp it? I'm fascinated by the immense effort of the Apollo program of the 60s, which still believe is deeply underrated culturally because of the prejudice against the United States and the fact that it was a child of the Cold War. It was a child of the Cold War, but my God, what a brilliant child.
Yeah.
It did something that people, one's children's generation, probably some of them don't even believe happened because they don't see it happening anymore.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't happen now, they think it didn't happen.
But it is a symbol of all this you've been talking about, stretching out, reaching to broaden the horizon, to find the truth. It's the human story.
Yeah, man is in a much more critical condition than he imagines. One of the great drugs of the Western world and probably East today is this notion of universal progress. This is the great fiction. It's nice to think we're heading for an apocalypse of truth, but nothing in history prior to ourselves suggests that this is inevitable. And I think the Rosicrucian story, as I tell it, proves that they really did think they were on the verge of the new age, the golden age. They did. There are aspects of the vision of the Rosicrucians which are true. We have had this amazing outpouring of technical scientific knowledge. There's no question that the world in the last 500 years changed more than the world in the previous 5,000. But it may be that something in that process has been lost.
It's lost, yeah.
And that is why we're still fascinated. When Christian Rosenkreutz goes to the East to find this secret, he knows it's an ancient secret. It's not a technological one. It's not something governments were in search of. It was something that the soul needs.